This course is called Revelation, End of the World, or Cause for Hope. Rhetorical question. By the end, I think you'll see that it is a cause for hope, if you can believe it. This is the third class. We'll be considering the origins of this book. But first, a very brief review. Last week, we talked about the prophetic writings, the Hebrew prophetic writings that developed as a genre of literature in its own right during the occupations and diaspora, the diaspora and various occupations of Israel by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians. So about a 400-year period where the prophets like Ezekiel and Isaiah, Amos, Joel, all the ones we talked about last week, Jeremiah, were writing. And a book like Isaiah was compiled over the course of time with two or three authors writing in the tradition of Isaiah, which was not uncommon or scandalous in its time. But the prophets wrote of a dire analysis of their nation state and their people and their specific community, and often specifically with a call to repent being the point. So they'll describe the landscape and basically talk about the house coming down and the nations invading and all of these things, and the land laid the waste, the temple destroyed. But then with this call to repent, and then a possible bright future and a new age. Even in the book of Lamentations, there's a slight nod at the end to a new age, meaning the old age, the one that was being experienced, filled with its violence and bloodshed and greed, and all that was wrong with the human race would come to an end, in a new age of a new heavens and a new earth. That's where that language comes from. Would come into our space and time. It wouldn't be an end to the human history, but it would be a new chapter. Out of that genre, the apocalyptic literature developed as a subgenre, and this started right towards the end of the period we were talking up above, in the 300s BCE, and then would continue up until about 100 years after the life of Jesus, 150 years after the life of Jesus. In fact, as we'll learn later, the book of Revelation was written approximately in the year 95. And the difference between the apocalyptic literature and the prophetic writings, and there are more nuanced ones, but these are the basics, is the apocalyptic literature would bring the battle between good and evil and set it at a cosmic scale. So it was no longer about the local governing authorities messing up, or the nation states that bordered your country. This was a battle that began in the heavenly realms and down to between the heavenly angels and the demons, and you think of it maybe as a dualistic worldview, or more towards that, with very little moral ambiguity, meaning there's a clear right and a clear wrong, and it's very obvious in these apocalyptic writings who is meant to come off poorly and who is meant to come off well. And it's believed that God will bring about a new age. It's not a possible new age, but a definite new age. But this will be a top-down reformation, where God will bring about a cosmic event or series of events to usher in the new age, and all of the disorientation and confusion that happens in the transition, that the vivid images and symbols and metaphors are trying to describe, are trying to give an idea to the tone and tenor and the way that this shift and change may be experienced using metaphors, symbols, and over-the-top fantastical visions to describe the status quo and then the pending cosmic battle to the final conclusion. And it often contains a messianic figure, or Christos is the Greek word for that, which was a Greek word before it was given to Jesus the Christ, but to signify him as the Messiah who was to bring about the new age. And so when Jesus came, he spoke in these apocalyptic terms. He would quote from the prophets, and through the three synoptic gospels, there is, especially in Matthew, in the 24th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, there's a lot of talk about the end of the age, and Jesus describes it in terms that fit within the apocalyptic genre, the events transpiring with the wars and rumors of wars and the earthquakes in diverse places, etc. The difference, though, is Jesus would speak of that coming, the coming new age, or the realm of God, is what he would say, the kingdom of God. But the twist was, he spoke of it as if it were immediate. He brought it with him while it was rolling out and influencing the world and changing the world. And then he did also talk of a final conclusion where God would find satisfaction in redeeming and restoring all that could be redeemed and restored. So that's a brief I guess not as brief as I'd intended, overview of the apocalyptic literature and what we talked about last week. Tonight, we're going to go over who wrote Revelation, in what context was it written, and what issues did John write to address. So who wrote Revelation? John. Someone named John did. It's right there in the very beginning lines in the opening salvo. And that's about all we know. There are no other biographical details given in the text. Within the first century of its composition, in fact, the fact that we knew little of Revelation's author seems to have been generally accepted. So you don't have anybody in the first century of its writing, around the year 95 and thereafter, really speculating as to who the author was, because people generally accepted that it's a man named John. And there's other things that you can discern about this person from the Greek he used and other things we'll talk about in a moment. But aside from that, and that he wrote it on Patmos, we don't really know. But people did begin to speculate around the year 200 if one of the Johns mentioned in the scriptures could be the author. The first time this was brought up that we know of was in the writings of a man named Justin Martyr around the year 200. First time, 100 years after the writing, that it was floated that maybe an apostle or a disciple could have written this book. And the obvious candidate for its writing could be the disciple / apostle John, the son of Zebedee. The problem is, at the time of its writing, John, the son of Zebedee, would be about 90 years old, which I realize doesn't disqualify him as the author per se, but also taking into account all of the travel he would be doing and all of these other things, it's hard to conceive. But also, the most telling evidence, I think, to suggest that the son of Zebedee did not write Revelation is that the author makes no claim in the book to be an apostle. And in the other books that we know John wrote, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, he does describe himself as an apostle and a disciple. He makes no reference of himself as a disciple. And he doesn't even claim to have met Jesus in the book of Revelation, except in a vision, which would be odd if this was John, apostle, the disciple, son of Zebedee. But also, hey, Jay, could you mute the... Thank you. So anyway, never having met Jesus, except in a vision, these are all signs to point to this was just a man named John. Now, there was a chance that Revelation was written pseudonymously, as with other apocalyptic works. I just talked about Isaiah, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. We have this one book called Isaiah, but these books were compiled and comprised of more than one author, written over a period of time. And this was not a scandalous thought at the time. And so to suggest that Revelation may have been written in the tradition of John the Apostle, or the author of the Gospel of John, perhaps, it's plausible, except the name is so common at the time, it's more likely that his name was simply John. And we'll have to leave it at that. So in the end, what do we know? Again, man named John wrote the letter from an island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. More on that in a moment. These are all details you can get from the opening chapter. The last thing that we can discern, though, which you have to do some digging in some biblical research, is that he was most likely a Jewish Christian. One reason we think he was Jewish, Christian, born of Jew, convert to Christianity, a Jesus-following Jew, was that he had he was very familiar with the Hebrew Bible. He knew the stories. He knew Moses. He knew the prophets. He knew the details. He had a command of those narratives that would be odd for a Greek-speaking, non-Jewish man raised, in one of the provinces to really have, unless he was a nerdy scholar or something like that. They just had an interest. But we think that since he knew so much about the Hebrew Bible, he was very likely Jewish. But another reason why Bible scholars think that he was probably Jewish was because he had a very odd command of the Greek language. Odd command. And I'll explain what I mean right here about John's Greek. You wouldn't know this, and I learned this as if for the first time in the study up to this lesson. I'm sure I was told this in seminary when I took a class on Revelation, but Revelation contains the most peculiar Greek in the entire New Testament. Again, in our English translations, they put it in nice syntax for us to read it like the other books of the Bible so it doesn't feel too jarring. But the Greek is very very odd. There's nothing else like it anywhere, not even in other Greek writings outside of the Bible. The writer of Revelation has idiosyncratic ways of writing that are only found in this book. One of those things that's interesting is he consistently breaks the rules of Greek grammar. Now, is he doing this by mistake or is he doing it intentionally? We don't know. But he will also, in other places, write in slang and in ways that also come off as odd. Certainly not polished, certainly not the scholarly work that you would want, because literacy was so rare, and typically people wanted to write well when they wrote some tome like this with a clear intent and purpose. Much of it is difficult to translate into English in a way that is sensible, but also maintains the integrity of the text's intended meaning. I'll give you this example, one of many that I have read about. Revelation chapter 1, verse 4 reads, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is, and who was, and who is to come. Now, that's the way that most of our Bibles would translate it. That was, I think that was from the New Revised Standard Version, but I copied it out of a book I was reading about Revelation. But in the actual Greek, the way it would be read in English if it were translated exactly literally is grace to you and peace from he the is, and from he the was, and from he the coming one. And yes, that sounds as strange to the Greek speaker in the Greek as its more accurate English translation does to us. So I thought that was fascinating, and what gives 2 theories. And I've already talked about one of these. It's possible that his poor or strange Greek is the result of Hebrew being his primary language. No doubt you have met people who had English as their secondary language, who also spoke very well and you could understand them, but they had certain idiosyncrasies to their speech that they carried over from their upbringing or from their native language. That's possibly what's going on here. Although scholars don't quite know what to make of the parts of Revelation where John begins to use Greek in a more accurate way. There are places where he seems to show he can write when he wants to write in better grammar. So this has led others, and I like this next theory. I'm not sure how much, I don't think we can have confidence in either one of these really with absolute certainty, but some biblical scholars postulate that he's breaking the grammatical rules on purpose. Theory goes, like a rebellious school child using slang as a form of rebellion, perhaps John the Revelator is using street language to key in to who his audience is, which would be common people living in the Greek and Roman Empire, people who perhaps were sort of outside of the official institutions, and less proper people. So it's possible that he's just using language as a means of cueing into who are his people, or if it's because Hebrew is his primary language and he just is writing poorly and he can't help it, the end result is the same. It helps identify him with a less literate class. Now, as to the context in which John wrote, most Bible scholars believe that John wrote Revelation around the year 95 during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. I have a bust right here to your right of what he perhaps looked like. Now, I bring that up to note that some people believe today that John had the 21st century Christians in mind when he wrote it. If you want evidence for that, just turn on Christian television and watch people talk about it. It's like as if it was written as a portal through time to the year 2023. But it wasn't written with us in mind, to be honest with you, at least not in John's conception. It was, and we know that because he addresses the letter to 7 specific churches in Asia Minor. He was writing to Christians that were spread out through Asia Minor during a time of great anxiety for some of the Christians. Emphasis on some, because some Christians were sorely persecuted and killed during this time. And many others, though, found ways of assimilating well into the Roman culture. And this, too, would be an issue for John, one that he would want to address in this apocalypse. And you maybe could read his words to the church in Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3 to get an idea of how he might have felt about that sort of thing. So the letter is addressed to 7 churches spread throughout Asia Minor. And these cities these are cities that would have been taken by the Romans over the course of time, but are now fully assimilated into Rome's cultural life. And as such, the Christians there may have compromised their values. So in that context, John was banished to Patmos. What can we discern from that? Well, that was what was done to political dissidents and people that governing authorities thought might raise trouble and cause a dissension and disrupt the peace in the Roman Empire. But there are legends similar to how there are legends as to Revelation's authorship that began to develop centuries later. There are legends about the location of its writing and what life was like there for John on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, modern day Turkey. I've got a map here so you can get an idea as to where we're talking about here. One legend along that line that assumes that first it was probably John, son of Zebedee, John the Apostle, which wasn't, in all likelihood was not, but also that apostle went through great suffering on the way to the island and then on the island. So one thing I read that is repeated over and over again in other websites and things I found was a story where John was apparently boiled in oil, again at the age of like 90, survived, and was then sent to Patmos to waste away working in the mines, as the story goes. And that little anecdote comes from Tertullian, writing around, again, 100 years after the book was written, a full century after Revelation's composition. The problem is there is no historical evidence of this, of John being boiled in oil or anything of the like until a full century after he lived. And also, from what we know about Patmos, life there was not arduous in the way that some people describe what John's life would have been like there. So here's what was likely the case. This bare bones, simplest answer, what could most likely be what's going on here. A Christian dissident named John was teaching a message that made the Roman officials uneasy. So they banished him to an island like so many other political dissidents. There, they were expected to find some way to provide for themselves and could otherwise live well so long as they didn't leave the island. So you get a job, you could eke out a living for yourself. You just don't leave the island is the point. And life on Patmos, from what we've discerned through archaeological digs and writings around that time, was not too bad. Patmos had a harbor where ships could come in and you could get exports and imports, had a fort, which is what you're looking at right here at the top of a hill for safety and protection. It even had an athletic organization that we have read about on inscriptions on walls. Also, inscriptions found by archaeologists tell us that they had banquets and temples to, I say the gods is what I meant to write. And here's the thing, there were no mines. There are no mines on Patmos. So any story that has them working in the mines couldn't have happened. The only thing odd or different about this island apparently was this man John, the prophet. Now, from that island, he had a vision, as we read in the first chapter, and in this book, he addressed 3 issues in the 7 churches to which he was writing, and they are persecution, assimilation, and complacency. And we will deal with each one of those in turn. Perhaps the scenes of cosmic conflict described in Revelation resonated with some of John's audience because they fully understood that there were violent forces unleashed in the world. They knew this from their own experience. Sometimes this violence would take the form of state-sanctioned persecution against Jews and Christians. And in fact, just with around a decade of the composition of, actually, I think it was in the year 86 specifically, if I'm not mistaken, all of the Jews were kicked out of Rome, the city, leaving the synagogues to the Gentile converts to Christianity. And there's a whole lot to be said about that too, but I'm just trying to paint a picture where occasionally you'd have state-sanctioned persecution against Jews and Christians. And an impression of persecution that has developed centuries later imagines this as a time of massive, nationwide and organized persecution of Christians en masse. Modern scholarship, however, has called into question the scale of persecution during Domitian's reign, during the time of the writing of Revelation specifically. We do not find evidence of Christians that are tortured and killed en masse during this time. Rather, what you have is persecution that's localized and from the bottom up. So don't think, the emperor making a decree and then soldiers going out and rounding everybody up. Rather, it would be more a problem in localities where a neighbor or somebody would take issue with a Christian, and it was illegal to be a Christian or a Jew during different periods of the Roman Empire, not during all the periods, obviously, but during some. And if that happened, if your neighbor reported you or something like that, then you might get into some trouble. But it was decided on a situation by situation basis. Now, this is a lot of fun, and I hope I've been excited about this next part all day. Because I'd like to share with you a letter written by Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governing official in a province called Bithynia, which is in modern day Turkey. And he wrote this letter in the year 112, which puts it nearly 20 years after the writing of Revelation, but still in the same time frame. And he's writing to Tertullian, who was the emperor at that time. And he is writing for some advice about how to handle Christians. He has just executed a few of them, and he's writing to the emperor to make sure he's done it correctly, or he's doing it right, because he doesn't want to get in trouble. And so the emperor replies, and I'm going to read for you these letters in part because I find them fascinating, but it'll also paint for you a picture of the ways by which a Christian might experience persecution during this time frame. So I didn't type it out. I'm just going to read it for you. This is from Pliny the Younger. Last name, the surname is Secundus. So if you hear Secundus later, that's referring to the same person. And the Emperor Trajan, the Emperor of Rome, writes to Pliny the Younger, I have never been present at the interrogation of Christians. Therefore, I do not know how far such investigations should be pushed and what sort of punishments are appropriate. I have also been uncertain as to whether age makes any difference, or whether the very young are dealt with in the same way as adults, whether repentance and renunciation of Christianity is sufficient, or whether the accused are still considered criminals because they were once Christians, even if they later renounced it, and whether persons are to be punished simply for the name Christian, even if no criminal act has been committed, or whether only crimes associated with the name are to be punished. Oh, sorry, this is not the emperor. Yes, this is the emperor writing. No, this is Pliny. This is Pliny writing to the emperor. I apologize. I got that wrong. This is Pliny's letter to the emperor asking for his advice. It continues. In the meantime, writes Pliny, I have handled those who have been denounced to me as Christians as follows. I asked them whether they were Christians. Those who responded affirmatively, I have asked a second and third time under threat of death penalty. If they persisted in their confession, I had them executed. For whatever it is that they are actually advocating, it seems to me that obstinacy and stubbornness must be punished in any case. Others who labor under the same delusion, but who were Roman citizens, I have designated to be sent to Rome. As an aside, you may recall how Paul was sent to Rome because he was a Roman citizen. Similar deal here. In the course of the investigations, Pliny writes, as it usually happens, charges are brought against wider circles of people, and the following special cases have emerged. An unsigned placard was posted accusing a large number of people by name. Those who denied being Christian now or in the past, I thought necessary to release, since they evoked our gods according to the formula I gave them, and since they offered sacrifices of wine and incense before your image, and I had brought in for this purpose along with the statues of our gods. I also had them curse Christ, and it is said that real Christians cannot be forced to do any of these things. Others charged by this accusation at first admitted that they had once been Christians, but had already renounced it. They had, in fact, been Christians, but had given it up. Some of them 3 years ago, and some even earlier, some as long as 25 years ago. Now, that would have been during the time of Domitian, by the way, down the time of the writing of Revelation. The emperor concludes, Pliny concludes, all these worshiped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ. The emperor responded to that letter with this short paragraph. My secundus, you have chosen the right way with regard to the cases of those who have been accused before you as Christians. Nothing exists that could be considered a universal norm for such cases. Christians should not be sought out, but if they are accused and handed over, they are to be punished, but only if they do not deny being Christians and demonstrate it by the appropriate act, i.e., the worship of our gods. Even if one is suspect because of past conduct, he or she is to be acquitted in view of repentance. End quote. So again, that first thing was Pliny the Younger, the guy you're looking at. The response was the Emperor Trajan. And from that, what you should discern is, yes, there was persecution, even Christians executed, but it was not empire-wide in scale. It was localized and would largely have to do with who was the local governing official and who your neighbors were and how annoyed they were at you for being a Christian. And even then, you read from the emperor's words, he emphasizes caution. He said, don't seek them out. We're not going hunting Christians. We are instead, if somebody comes to you with a complaint, hear it out, run them through the gambit. And really seems to be stubbornness, seems to be what they really are upset about. So persecution, next problem, assimilation. So imagine, in the context that I've just described, you've become a Christian in a Roman province in the first century. And let's imagine that you don't have any of those nosy neighbors that would cause you problems, like we were just reading about. You're not going to get turned into the authorities. You know your people, you know your town. You're not worried about that. In fact, when your neighbors discover that you are a Christian, they don't really care. What business is it of theirs? And besides, people are used to a diverse panoply of gods and goddesses to choose from, Rome being a polytheistic society. But then comes the great feast, the cultural event of the year. You've attended every year since you've been born. Your city turns out in full and welcomes in tourists from the surrounding countryside. Your friend turns to you and asks if you were going. Problem is, the feast is in honor of the goddess Artemis. Now you don't believe in Artemis. You don't even think that there is such a god, but you are unsure if it would be appropriate to eat meat sacrificed to her or any other deity for that matter. How if you are expected to offer a sacrifice to the goddess yourself or offer a prayer? What would you do? Biblical commentator Brian Blount writes of the problem of assimilation. In Roman-occupied Asia Minor, in the last decade of the first century, during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, there existed a strong motivation to accommodate. In Rome's ideological infrastructure, religion and politics were quite intentionally mixed. Worship often mutated into politics. Politics was often exercised through religion. Worship of Roman deities not only demonstrated a cultic devotion and communal piety, it also signaled loyalty to the Roman state, which was mythologically connected and practically founded upon them. It is not surprising then that the mother goddess would savor the name Roma, or that the messianic hopes for the empire should be bound up in the person of the emperor. This bending of politics and worship was especially evident in Asia Minor, where John and his 7 churches were located. Particularly during the last decade of the first century, emperor worship flourished. So answers to this dilemma varied from church to church, province to province, individual to individual. Some refused to accommodate and then faced little consequence. They maybe lived in a place where people really didn't care what you did in this regard. Others faced great consequences, as maybe the people described in the letter from Pliny the Younger to the emperor. Obviously, they were killed. But then still others, and this is probably who John has in mind, the rest of us, who find a middle way, a way to remain in the society but also fit in through a series of compromises. Blount writes, the Asia Minor Christians were passing themselves off as every other emperor worshiping meat sacrificed to pagan gods eating Greco-Romans. Lastly, the problem of complacency. While some Christians suffered great persecution during Roman rule and others struggled to find the balance between accommodation and holding fast to faith, still other Christians thrived under Roman rule. John addressed revelation to one church in chapter 3, Laodicea. Of this church, he writes, For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, I need nothing. You do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Christians who thrived under Roman occupation had to find a way to reconcile themselves to the suffering caused by the Roman Empire. Some, like the Christians in Laodicea, felt that their material wealth may even be a sign of God's favor. So why think twice? But John believed that such Christians who have become comfortable and complacent in the security brought on by material wealth have in fact lost faith. Or as Craig Koester summarizes in the Great Courses Lectures on Revelation, they are wealthy economically, but the material comfort has zapped the vitality of their faith. I'm reminded now of the various individuals we meet in the Gospels who seem to have the same issue, tax collectors and others profiting by way of an economic system that hurts, harms, and even leads to the deaths of many others. So basically, to summarize, John is writing to Christians throughout Asia Minor, Minor Turkey. Some were persecuted, some were thriving, while most were somewhere in between. How they would receive this letter would depend on their social standing. The persecuted, for them, the visions of Revelation should remind them that life will win out. There is hope for a future. God will do this. So they should try and endure faithfully to the end. To the assimilators, I put myself somewhere in that category here. The visions of Revelation may act as a challenge, as the stark dichotomies, good versus evil, dark versus light, etc., force them to make a choice. No more accommodating. In the meantime, up your commitment to Jesus the Christ and to the ways of the realm of God. And lastly, to the complacent and comfortable, which I also find myself with one foot in there, perhaps both feet. The visions in Revelation call them to open their eyes, where before prosperity made them oblivious to the rot at the heart of the Roman Empire and its economic system. Next class, Wednesday, November 1st, 7 p.m., same time, same place. We'll be going over Revelations 1 through 3, and also those 7 churches that have been referenced many times throughout. Do we have any questions? Or comments or observations?
So is this view of the 3 situations of the Christians, is this substantiated in some of the other writings?
Well, it's substantial.
Some are kind of in between. Some are, getting along fine.
Well, yeah, we discern that. Next week we'll talk about what John said to those 7 churches, and we see in those words of encouragement or warning, depending on which church, or caution, sometimes mix of both. All of these themes reflected. Some of the churches you can tell he's writing to sorely persecuted, even people in their community being killed for the cause. And then others, he will write and laud certain attributes that they do well, but then also name some things that are problematic. And then in the letter to Laodicea, he is scathing in his critique. But then as the book rolls on, you'll begin to see why he feels that way as you find out where each of these churches fits within the scheme of Revelation and how their ways are reflected in the ways of the Roman Empire as revealed by way of these fantastic visions that we'll be considering later. We also know from other writings of the period that come before and after about what things were like in the Roman Empire for Christians at that time. John's wasn't the only letter, obviously, to address churches. Most of the New Testament is comprised of letters addressed to churches, and in those we find similar problems and with similar advice. The difference is this is an apocalyptic work, which utilizes a different writing method to try to convey the important points that the revelator John wants to raise.
One comment, one question.
Sure.
I have run into Christians who believe that statement. I believe it's at the end of John's gospel, where Jesus is talking to Peter, and says,
Be my sheep.
no, about John, and basically says, if it be the Father's will, this one will not know death before I come again. So they walk around that not only was John still alive in time to write this book,
Oh yeah.
he's hanging around now.
Oh
out
wow.
there. Okay. And that's fine. And I honestly don't need to know the answer to that question, but I do think that ties into why it's important to some people to make John the Revelator and John the Beloved the same entity. The question escaped my brain. Is there any indication why the Council of Nicaea included this book?
Yes. I didn't come prepared to answer that question in full, but what I recall is that it was quite contentious, and some did not want it included. It was similar to the Gospel of Thomas, sort of debatable. So most of the Gospels up to that point were not debatable in Gospels and Letters, but Revelation was still one that people those apostolic fathers around the time of Council of Nicaea found problem or issues or didn't believe it should be included. But it won the argument and was put in the canon.
My limited studies of it are that Marcion in his holy book had included Luke, Acts, and the letters of Paul, because his version of Christianity was the other disciples had it wrong and Paul was the only authority. Probably a highly edited version of Acts. So you see how well we want to get our version of Luke and Acts out there, and Paul is Paul, and we included him. And then you have the other three Gospels, and then you have this book, and you have the letters from some of the other, First and Second Peter. The books that Marcion had in there are named for the people Paul's addressing. The books that Marcion didn't are generally the ones that are named for the person who wrote them.
Oh, okay.
Because they aren't written by Paul. Then this book does not fit in any of those categories. So I am mildly curious about. I remember it being contentious, and I remember my professor, Rabbi Joe. I remember Rabbi Joe talking about when we studied Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity that this book kind of falls out of the sky compared to everything else.
There's nothing else like it. That's true.
Yeah, and it's like why So if anybody had done any scholarly work to come up with why in the end they felt this one was, when the Gospel of Thomas wasn't and the Gospel of Peter wasn't, and all the other apocryphal texts we consider apocryphal now, I should say, weren't, but this one was kept. So
yeah, I will come next week. You made me curious because I do remember studying that. You made me curious. But I do remember it was contentious.
So I was told that John was sent to Patmos, and then there was a change in the Roman government there. The new emperor came in, and the new emperor was not as critical of the Christians, and that's why he was released from Patmos, because he didn't object to the Christians so much. Is that follow your line?
Well, in lieu of the reason I read that letter from Pliny the Younger to Trajan was to paint a picture of what persecution was like in that period. And
may not have been an emperor. It may have been a local official.
Pliny the Younger was a local official, and he wrote to the emperor that letter I read to make sure he was doing it right. And in that he persecuted the Christians and he killed a few of them. But my point of bringing that up was to paint a picture for what it was like at that time. And one of the people referenced in that. Let me find it, pull it back up. In what I quoted, when they reference as Christians that had been around 25 years before, that would have been around the time of Domitian. And what I'm trying to say is, what I described would basically be what the landscape was like based on what archaeologists and anthropologists and historians can discern of the time. There was persecution of Christians. It wasn't widespread in scale. It was localized. And as far as the specific person we're talking about, the writer of Revelation, I find that very unlikely. For one, he was born in the year 6, and Revelation was written in the year 95, we believe, or thereabouts. And if he were to leave Patmos, I'd put him in his early 90s. Well, again, Jay, that's why you need this theory where he's like timeless, right?
Yeah, but she's talking about the political landscape shifting because the emperor changed. Right.
I'm not aware of how much different Trajan's politics were from Domitian's. They both persecuted Christians. My impression is they persecuted them in about the same way.
Irritating, stubborn people.
Well, one of the churches, don't ask me which one because I don't remember, but it said that stand fast, the persecution, well, I think it says will last 10 days, but whether it meant 10 days or not, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
But there would be a period of persecution and they were to remain faithful. So obviously there was persecution
There
going
was
on.
persecution, and I'm not debating that. When I grew up, I watched a lot of movies where like made in the 50s or so, they're about 60s, and the emperor would be like, I command that we get all the Christians, and they would go out on horses and just go get them from towns. That actually, we find little historical evidence that something like that actually occurred. What we find instead is what I've described. Persecution for sure, illegal to be a Christian, but those stories we get later, where we have whole dialogues written from the martyr who, while being burned, is looking to heaven and saying certain things. Those all come centuries after these events were to have transpired. And in all likelihood, the stories that people tell centuries after the fact. Now, if my brother were here, he would not like what I just said. One of the pictures that I got for this came from an Orthodox site, where they are very clear. The Orthodox, like our little chapel back here, they believe that it was written. I mean, this is part of their tradition that is as codified nearly as scripture. They believe that this is John, son of Zebedee, who is also John the Beloved in the Gospel of John, who also wrote the book of Revelation, who was also boiled in oil and sent to work on Patmos. I didn't read anything about mines. I don't believe any of those things happened, to be honest with you.
I heard it was labor, but
perhaps labor, but
labor could be a lot of things. Labor
You're
does
right.
not define how you are working.
I also had a discussion about how they date a lot of things.
Mm.
And essentially is they wait until the document is referenced by other documents.
That's one way. That is one of the clues. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they do a couple other things and they guesstimate it. And a lot of people go, academicians don't want to be seen as favoriting their cognitive bias.
Mm-hmm.
So they're probably going to put their estimates later rather than earlier. So when you see 90 for this book and you see 70 for Matthew, I think, isn't that traditionally when
Yeah. They're about. And those are the rounded figures, pretty much.
Right. It's like plus or minus what, yeah. And I don't think it's, again, this used to be important to me when I was in my 20s and there was going to be a factual, the Tom Hanks movies, Da Vinci Code, but not heresy. Interpretation of the Bible that's going to be absolutely true. And I needed that. Yeah.
I had the same mindset.
Now that I don't really care, but I also feel like, somewhere, I really feel like it's like by the year 90, this book was written. By the year 70, Matthew was written is probably a more emotionally accurate way of saying it. Matthew could have been written 10 minutes after Jesus was crucified, hidden in a jar in the desert, found by somebody, edited, published, later. And the way they go about researching it, they wouldn't know that.
It'd be impossible to find out that.
Yeah. It'd be impossible to find out. Do I believe that? It's not important, right?
Yeah.
I don't believe it's important, but I also think that that is a conflict that comes up between the liberal academic side of Christianity and the literal interpretation side of Christianity, because one side needs it to have been written by Matthew 10 minutes after Jesus ascended into heaven, and the other side says, but our scholarship says this,
And they sound and because scholars tend to be and they don't commit to an idea unless they're fairly certain, so they can sound a bit equivocal and wishy-washy.
Right. Well, it's not just that. It's that, why is it important? I understand to the literal fundamentalist why it's important, because you are the keeper of truth, and that gives you power. And if you don't have that power, then you lose something of your identity, whatever. But as someone who's more interested in delving into the merit of ideas, I'm like, the calendar is just something a pope made up. Why are we arguing about it? So,
I agree that the ideas are more important than the timeline, and that I enjoy the scholarly process by which they come to their best guesses with some degrees of certainty about when things were written and in what situation, with humility, knowing we can't know everything. But at the same time, I appreciate what you're saying, that it can come off, well, it can feel like a threat to people who really insist, really need it to be a certain way in their framework. And it's not intended to be that way. And a lot to pick apart there. Well, I won't belabor anything if there are no other questions. Now, I am here at the church, and I understand it's much easier to hop on, and I don't mind doing it through Zoom. But I will let you know that if you do ever decide to come by the church for the lesson, I've got treats and water and different things, and we're ready for it. In the meantime, if you need another look at the schedule, next week we'll be going over Revelation 1-3, 7 churches, and also the first chapter, which is just the introductory and the vision beginning to unfold. And then here's that reading list that I keep showing you. The books that I use the most for this lesson would be the one by Brian K. Blount, and the one by Leonard Thompson, and the Great Courses by Professor Craig R. Koester. Those have been the three that for this lesson I used the most. And that'll change depending on what we're talking about. Until next week, God bless you and keep you, and I'll hopefully see you all soon.
See you Sunday. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.